Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Duty to Serve and What It Means for Rural Housing. My name is Shantaria Charleston, HAC's Training Manager, and I will be the host for this call today. If you have not already done so, please ensure that you have access to both the audio and video portion of the webinar. To access the PowerPoint for today's call, please follow the link on your meeting confirmation email. All participants are in listen-only mode, which means your line is muted. However, we are very interested in your questions and feedback, so during the call today, to submit a question, please use the Q&A box that appears on the lower right-hand side of your screen. Today's webcast is being recorded. Both the recording and presentation will be available on HAC's website, www.ruralhome.org, shortly following the webinar. So I see a lot of familiar names today, but for those of you that are not familiar with the Housing Assistance Council, HAC is a national nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. that assists local organizations with building affordable housing in rural America. With the mission to improve housing conditions for the rural poor, HAC places an emphasis on striving to serve the poorest of the poor in the most rural places. HAC emphasizes local solutions, empowerment of the poor, reduced dependency, and self-help strategies. HAC assists with the development of both single and multifamily housing and promotes homeownership for working low-income rural families through a self-help sweat equity construction method. So if you're interested in learning more about HAC services or products, HAC has an office near you. If you have questions or require assistance, please contact your nearest HAC regional office. Those office locations and contact information is being displayed on the screen. That information will also be provided as part of the handout materials on HAC's website following the call. Also, please mark your calendar and join us for the following trainings. We have our first CRA webinar taking place on February 25th, as well as our second CRA webinar taking place on March 16th at 2 p.m. We have a couple of place-based trainings, too, that are taking place. We have Advanced Financial Management, March 8th through 9th in North Charleston, South Carolina, as well as our Section 502 packaging training taking place March 8th through 10th in North Charleston, South Carolina. Also, please be on the lookout for information on our Serving America's Aging Veterans Symposium, which is taking place on May 18th in Washington, D.C. So again, I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Duty to Serve and What It Means for Rural Housing. At this point, I'd like to welcome and introduce our speaker for today, Lance George. Lance is HAC's Director of Research and Information and is also responsible for overseeing research, information, public relations, and communications activities that serve to further knowledge of rural housing policy, issues, and trends. Before coming to HAC, Lance worked for Frontier Housing, Inc., a nonprofit organization that builds affordable homes for low-income families in Appalachia, Eastern Kentucky. So at this point, I will turn the webinar over to Lance.
Thank you, Shantaria. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us in this discussion today. We really do view this as a discussion. We know you're all interested in the duty to serve and really working towards its intended purposes. We understand this is a robust group. There are probably members on the call or participants on the call who work with with the GSEs and the duty to serve on a daily basis and really understand it. And there are probably other participants on the call who really want to know just what does this mean for my community. So it's a robust group, a very wide degree of variation. And within that, HAC's goals are generally twofold. The first of which is we want to provide information about duty to serve. This is something we've thought seriously about, and we want to share some of our insights and help really inform any comments. Of equal importance, we also want to glean any insights that you may have, ideas, issues. Many of you are working in these communities. You know them very well. You understand these dynamics very well. So we want this to be an open dialogue today and in the future going forward. So that's generally, again, kind of a twofold our goals on this. And I would say maybe I would add a third tertiary goal, which would be we'll talk a little about the history, but the duty to serve was issued once before, and there weren't that many comparatively to the large volume of comments. There weren't that many that focused on rural communities or the rural component of the rule. So we really want to enhance and have as many people comment and provide their input on the rural component of the rule as possible. So I think those are some of our primary goals. Just a couple of preliminary remarks. Today's discussion is largely informational. The Housing Assistance Council is not going to present our comments or our final comments. Like many of you, we're still working through them and formulating them. So we don't have final comments. We do promise that we will make them available to the public before the comment period is due. But at this point, this is largely an informational discussion to help provide insights on the rule and basically to facilitate a discussion. And secondly, we're really mostly going to focus on the rural component of the rule. We understand that all three components are very important, especially in rural communities, and there's a lot of cross-pollination between the manufactured housing and the housing preservation. But given our limited time and a lot of the inquiries that we've already had, we're really going to focus our comments today largely on the rural elements of the rule. Not to say that the others aren't important, and we're willing to kind of discuss or field questions about those, but the discussion, again, will largely focus on the rural component of duty to serve, or the rural specific component of duty to serve. I mentioned before there might be a broad variation of participants on the call. We did want to generally gauge or assess in a highly unscientific poll, but see your familiarity with duty to serve. That I think that'll help our discussion today and also our process going forward. So at this point, Shantara is going to administer, again, a highly unscientific poll where you assess maybe your understanding or your knowledge of duty to serve. And I think within that, possibly also the rural component of duty to serve.
All right, thanks, Lance. So it looks like we have a few people already indicating their current knowledge, but if we could go ahead and please assess your current knowledge of duty to serve regulations. Highly knowledgeable, somewhat familiar, or low familiarity. So looks like we have about, there's a good percentage of folks that have low familiarity with the knowledge of duty to serve regulations. So we're going to give it a few more seconds. I see a few more people kind of chiming in there. All right, so it looks like about 60% of people, or 61%, have low familiarity with about, well, it's still changing, so another few seconds. All right, so we will go with these numbers. About 60% have low familiarity, and there's about 26% that are somewhat familiar, and we have a good group, about 14% that are highly knowledgeable. So, Lance, looks like we've got a pretty diverse group, some knowledgeable, some are, kind of getting into it.
Thanks, Shantara. That's really helpful, and I think that helps inform our discussion today. At some level, it's going to be, as we noted before, we're going to go over some of the highlights of the rule itself and try to provide clarity or insight to those. Some elements of the rule, quite frankly, related to the rural provision are slightly technical, and I don't really want to get mired into the weeds, so we'll try to have a good balance of presenting information, especially with assessing the knowledge base of the participants in the discussion. To start out, we might just provide some broad overview or parameters of duty to serve. Duty to serve was a provision of the Housing and Economic Recovery Act of 2008. It mandates that the GSEs, also known as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government-sponsored enterprises, have a duty to serve underserved markets, and in doing so, They primarily increase liquidity and investment capital in these markets. And we also wanted to note the Federal Housing Finance Agency, who issued the rule and is generally administers duty to serve and is the regulator of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So we wanted to get some basic parlance out there. The GSEs, these terms will be used kind of frequently or regularly within the discussion today. The GSEs, often referred to as Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, or we might often also refer to them as the enterprises. And we'll often probably use the acronym of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, FHFA. We hope they don't take umbrage to that. We're used to being called HAC, but please correct us if that's not the case. But for expediency purposes, we might often refer to HAC and the GSEs or the enterprises, or FHFA and or the regulator. We also thought it would be helpful to provide just a very brief timeline of duty to serve, given its history, somewhat brief history, but I think it has an interesting timeline. On July 30th, the 2008 Housing Economic Recovery Act was enacted, and that established a duty to serve. Shortly thereafter, a couple of months after, the GSEs or the enterprises entered conservatorship. So on September 8th, 2008, they entered conservatorship. I think they actually technically entered a day before, but it was publicly announced on September 7th. Roughly a year later, FHFA presented an advance notice of rulemaking around duty to serve, largely where they were gleaning ideas about how to implement the duty to serve requirement. And roughly a year later, a little less than a year later, on June 7th, 2010, the duty to serve proposed rule was established. However, if I can use kind of a rural colloquialism, it largely laid fallow for about 5 or 6 years. It was not enacted or implemented between 2010 until recently, largely under the specter of the conservatorship that the GSEs were in. Then on December 18th, 2015, about 2 months ago, the duty to serve proposed rule was reissued. And another very important date that we want to make you all aware of is that on March 17th, 2016, comments are due to FHFA on the proposed rule. Again, another very elemental or basic component is there are three specific markets identified in the duty to serve rule: rural housing, housing preservation, which includes both single and multifamily housing preservation, and manufactured housing. Again, we'll reiterate that today's discussion will largely focus on the rural component of that rule. Compared to some of the other underserved markets, the regulatory language of the proposed rule is relatively straightforward regarding the rural component of the rural market. And one of the primary, what they call a core activity, is quite frankly to define eligible activities for the rural market. And in doing so, they need to define what a rural area is. That's a central component, and that's a lot of where we have informally been receiving a lot of our comments. So the GSEs are tasked with serving this particular large underserved rural market, but defining that market is kind of a core element. And in doing so, I kind of got ahead of myself. In doing so, the approach that FHFA took was to identify 4 generally well-established definitions or classifications or proxies of rural territory that are currently used or implemented. And they basically provided an overview of them and then selected one of them as the proposed rural area definition for duty to serve. What we'll generally do, or very briefly do, is try to generally present each of those definitions and some of their core elements, and then talk about the proposed rural area definition in the rule in a little more detail. So the first of the rural areas proposed in the rule was USDA, what we would call USDA-RD eligible areas. And generally, these are areas that are eligible for USDA rural housing activity for most USDA rural housing programs. There was a lot of discussion around the USDA-RD eligible areas in the initial rulemaking process in 2009 and 2010, and this was noted in the rule. Hopefully you see a projection of a map. Generally on the map, the green areas identified in the map are those that are USDA-RD eligible or would be kind of the rural proxy. The white areas are those that are not eligible. In many respects, this is probably the most expansive definition or classification of rural, at least of the four presented. It includes roughly 109 million in population, and that's an estimate, or roughly 1/3 of the U.S. population. And I think that asterisk with the estimate, all of these definitions have pros and cons, and FHFA identified some of them why they thought they would possibly be good definitions and not so great definitions for the proposed rule. So on the positive side of the ledger for the USDA eligible areas, it is often widely used and kind of widely accepted, if not completely understood. It is a relatively complex definition. It has levels of complexity. Generally, it's eligible areas of 20,000 or below population or 10,000 below in a metropolitan area, but it has a lot of other gradations. And I don't want to get into the specifics or the weeds or the technicalities of a lot of these definitions. But on the negative side, or some of the drawbacks to the definition, at least according to FHFA, was that it is not a stable definition. It has the propensity to change from year to year. And it also has issues with what they would classify, or maybe HAC would classify, in its operationalization, for the ability for the enterprises to actually use this to determine their rural territory. In many respects, it doesn't align to standard census geographies, and it's somewhat difficult, if I can use that term, to operationalize for these purposes. Another definition is the census-defined rural areas. This is a somewhat common definition kind of in the statistical world. It's not frequently used in the programmatic world to administer programs, although I would say in like many definitions of rural use various components of definitions, and I think many definitions of rural use kind of the census-defined rural area. On the projection on the map, you'll notice the blue areas indicate what would be census-defined rural, and you'll notice some kind of what I would classify as almost or kind of call constellation type activities or constellation type patterns of white areas, and those would be urbanized areas and urban clusters, which are generally a proxy for urban areas. And you'll notice the larger concentrated white areas are probably the larger urbanized areas or your larger cities than you might think of, and the smaller spattering, the more constellation patterns of white are smaller urban clusters. Generally, there's about 59 million persons in census-defined rural areas, and it comprises about 19% of the U.S. population. Again, this is not a widely used definition, but sometimes elements of it are used in other definitions. FHFA also presented the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's rural area definition, which is a relatively new definition. It has, again, several different, it's a combination of different components or elements of rurality or different measures, one of which would be adjacent to OMB metropolitan areas, urban influence codes, and rural blocks. CFPB uses this definition to administer some of their regulations and some of their activities. One of the primary drawbacks noted by FHFA was that, especially the third element, the rural blocks, which is a more recent iteration of this definition, and again, the same kind of concept of difficult to operationalize. We at HAC would somewhat agree with that. We tried to provide maps of everyone to give a graphic illustration of what these areas might look like, and we simply can't provide that for various reasons because of the nature of the blocks. It makes it very difficult to operationalize this definition, and very much so could in the the activities proposed for this rule. And then finally, the regulator proposed the rural duty to serve area definition as a census tract, and they went with a sub-county designation, which we think is a move in the right direction, but a census tract outside of a metropolitan area, or a census tract inside a metropolitan area that is not outside of an urbanized area or urban cluster, and they use the USDA Economic Research Services RUCA codes to classify that. And a graphic illustration, hopefully you're seeing an orange map. The orange areas on this map would be the proposed FHFA definition of duty to serve rural areas. The white areas would be ineligible under the proposed rule. Generally, according to our calculations, these areas include about 77.1 million persons and would encompass around 25% of the U.S. population. So somewhere in between some of the other definitions. And that's just an overview of the definitions and some insight into some of their characteristics. HAC looked specifically at the proposed definition by FHFA, and we had a couple of, I would say, general comments, and we'll try to illustrate them in some upcoming maps. One concept that we wanted to note is the concept that most of these definitions are what we would call an either-or definition. You're either urban or you're rural. You're metro or you're non-metro. You're eligible or you're non-eligible. And we think that there are large segments of the population that are actually, they don't fit into that mold. They're suburban. They're somewhere in between. And that's something that we want to look at, and particularly looking at sometimes suburban areas get included either in the urban area or the rural area, and that's something that we're cognizant of because we do believe the underserved mandate is to serve rural communities, and we don't want to serve, we just don't want the GSEs to get rural activity for suburban population. So the next map tries to illustrate what HAC would classify any areas in blue, either light blue or dark blue, are currently defined as a proposed rural area under the FHFA definition, but what HAC would generally consider suburban or exurban. The darker blue areas would indicate a suburban community, and the light areas would indicate an exurban community. Again, these are differing classifications. They're no different than the others. All definitions have their pros and cons, but HAC is cognizant of this element of particularly including suburban territory in kind of the rural mandate here. And to give a further illustration of this, so these areas, again, in the light blue or dark blue, are what HAC would consider generally either suburban or exurban based on another density measure. And we just paired this up with the GSE's recent activity. So the next map illustrates the darker the orange color, so the red area indicates the proportion of loans, or actually, I'm sorry, the number of loans that the GSEs purchased in these areas over the past 2 years. So this is only rural activity. The white area indicates the non-eligible or the kind of urban area here, and the orange area would indicate the FHFA proposed rural area, and the gradation colors would be the GSE's activity, combined activity in 2012, 2013, and 2014. The gray areas, they might be hard to differentiate, was there no GSE purchase activity. So again, trying not to make this too complicated, you'll notice that there's a lot more activity around those ineligible areas. And we think that some of that area, quite frankly, some of it's not suburban, but some of it is. So this is an area where we're interested and we're cognizant in our comments that a lot of the activity around some of these areas might be classified as rural under the rule, but in essence, in fact, might be suburban activity. So we're somewhat cognizant of that. According to HAC's calculations using these 3-year estimates of GSE activity, about 42% of all their loan purchases were in what HAC would classify as suburban or exurban territory, and about 2 to 3% of the landmass around these urban areas. So a lot of activity in those communities, and we just want to make sure, or we want to make sure that that we're not giving kind of rural credit for suburban activity. On the exact opposite side of the ledger, we also considered areas where we thought were deemed not rural under the FHFA calculation, but conceivably could be rural or should be potentially considered rural for the purposes of the activities identified. So in this map, and again, it's somewhat complicated, I can go through it in more detail later or offline, but the green areas are areas that are actually classified as not eligible under the proposed FHFA rule, but what HAC would consider potentially either rural or small town area. The darker green areas are what we would classify as a small town. Oftentimes these are the urban cluster that we mentioned before. they are omitted because of their density, but in many respects, Hack believes these are in essence small towns. They're not associated with generally large urban areas, and in many instances, they're kind of small town in character, and they do, in some instances, provide a lot of the multifamily housing, particularly in rural markets. So they're kind of areas where there's a lot of what would be classified as rural multifamily housing in the darker green. The lighter green areas are kind of another issue altogether, and for lack of a better term, we would call them what we think are anomalies. Again, not a very technical term, but there are some quirks within the methodology that FHFA incorporated, which would be the RUCA codes. HAC has been well aware of these for years. There's some minor issues with the way things are operationalized. For example, I wish I could zoom in, but you'll notice in South Dakota, depending on how well your geography is, mine's not great, but you'll notice a large green swath kind of to the west in western South Dakota. Well, most of that territory is actually considered not eligible, or it's not considered rural under this definition. But because of a quirk in the USDA RUCA codes, one little portion of Rapid City is located there, but a large segment of that that area is remotely rural in territory or highly rural. Some ones that are obvious to the eyes would be west of Salt Lake City, a very similar dynamic we think that are going on there. Also kind of in northern Arizona. Northern New Mexico, or northern Arizona. Some areas, and also in the west, where we think there are just some erroneous calculations there, and we might have to kind of dot our I's and cross our T's on that. So in general, I would say I'm really good at bad analogies, but we're trying to look at this at a Goldilocks kind of level, where in some elements we think the porridge is too hot, it's including too much suburban territory. In other elements, the porridge might be a little too cold. It's excluding some communities, some small towns that are actually really rural in nature or important to rural housing activities. And finally, there's just maybe some bad spice or too much salt or something added to the porridge in some of these anomalies that we found. So again, we're going through those, but I think those are our general observations on the current proposed definition of duty to serve for rural communities. As a service, because we understand that was a lot of information, and those maps might be hard to view from your projection, and you don't have the ability to look at them. We went through them relatively quickly, and there are a lot of concepts kind of thrown out there. So what we've done is we provide an interactive online map. The link is there. It's called Census Tract Lookup Resource, where we've provided an online lookup map where you can look at your community and say, is it eligible or is it not eligible? I will present with almost everything I do. There are a couple of caveats there. It's a very large map. It's a tract level map, but if you go to that resource, you should be able to look at your community. It can be a little slow. These are just very large maps. This service is not really optimized. I think in a few years these things will become much quicker. But we've tried to provide that as a resource to help you understand the rural eligibility and how it intersects in your community. In addition, just if you want to know more about tracts, I think this is a somewhat foreign concept. I would ask everybody in the room, I would maybe put up this informal poll. You probably know what county you live in, but I would challenge anybody to tell me what 11-digit census tract that you live in. They're just not as commonly understood. So if you go to the FFIEC website, it's a really good resource that allows you to hone in and look at tracts in your community and identify the tract number. Quite frankly, I would give kudos to the FFIEC for this. We think this site is better for tract kind of understanding your tracts than even some of the census websites. So those are two resources that we're providing that will hopefully better help you understand how the proposed rural definition intersects with your community. Within the rule, FHFA presents specific questions, and we're just reiterating those questions there. They're actually numbered, so when you respond to these questions, please say we're responding to question number 70. And question 70 would be, which one of the four definitions discussed above would better serve the duty to serve objectives, and if so, why? And then question number 71 is, How could operational concerns about the enterprise implementation under each of the definitions be addressed? So again, if you want to specifically address those questions, they ask that you identify them by name. A second major component of the rural duty to serve, the rural component of duty to serve, is a regulatory requirement of serving high-need rural communities, that the GSEs should increase liquidity in high-need rural communities. And we applaud the regulator for including this in the rule. We think these communities suffer from a lack of access to capital and mortgage investment, so we really applaud them for taking this first step. Similar to the previous iteration, we'll try to provide some overview of the definitional areas, and I think there'll be maybe a more robust discussion, probably offline after this call, about how we can meet the goals of increasing liquidity and capital, or help the GSEs, help them increase their activities in these communities. Generally, FHFA identified five regions or populations that they classified were high need or high need rural areas, and we'll briefly go through each of those. They indicated Middle Appalachia, which is what Hack would often refer to as Central Appalachia. They took more of the Tolkien-esque approach on naming this, which is fine, but it's generally 230 counties in the central, north central, and south central area of Appalachia as defined by the Appalachian Regional Commission. And so those counties identified in yellow or gold are the 230 counties identified as Middle Appalachia, where the GSEs are tasked with serving or providing increased activity in those communities. Another area is the lower Mississippi Delta, and this would include 219 counties in the lower Mississippi Delta portion of Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee, Missouri, Mississippi, and Louisiana. So, and there were, again, 219 counties and parishes in these communities identified in blue. Colonias, and this is the Colonias discussion within the rule is slightly nuanced. The first component would be that it would be an identified Colonia community within the border Colonias region. So within 150 miles north of the U.S.-Mexico border in the 4 border states. So that's identified in purple. Those are generally the 150-mile range within those 4 states, but it's not activities within that specific region. It's actually communities or identified Colonia communities within that 150-mile range. So we tried to provide a graphic illustration, and those of you familiar with South Texas, this is the very tip of South Texas. These purple areas are Colonias identified by the state, and that's what the proposed rule mandates is either state or community identified or some jurisdictional identified Colonia community in these states. So the darker purple areas are actual identified Colonias by the Texas Attorney General. That's an example, and in any of the 4 border states, if there's an identified Colonia community within the 150-mile range, those are eligible for duty to serve credit. Activity in those areas is eligible for duty to serve credit. Another largely population, although we tried to project it geographically, are persons in federally recognized Indian tribes located in an Indian area. So again, this is the green areas would indicate federally recognized Indian areas, and largely you'll notice they're kind of in the Southwest, in the American West and Southwest, and also in Alaska. So there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 556 federally recognized tribes or Alaska Native villages, and those are largely generally included in the rule. I would say in this particular area of the rule, these populations in the high need areas, I think there's some of the language is more vague and potentially up for interpretation. So we welcome your discussion on that, but that was our perception that some of the areas identified were more vague than in other components of the rule. And then a final group would be migrant and seasonal farm workers. FHFA paralleled with a Department of Labor definition, where the enterprises would receive credit for activities for migrant and seasonal farm workers. This is a DOL definition. It's more detailed, but generally a migrant agricultural worker engaged in agricultural work where they're generally absent overnight, or seasonal agricultural workers where they're not absent overnight, they're involved in agricultural work, but transported by day haul operation, and that's directly from the rule. So this is a general projection. The next slide shows kind of the U.S. map, and a general projection of all of the high need areas identified definitionally in the rule. These are largely political constructs in many elements. The Middle Appalachia would be from the Appalachian Regional Commission. The Lower Mississippi Delta is from the Lower Mississippi Delta Commission. The border Colonias elements of that are from the National Affordable Housing Act, and the green areas or Native American lands are largely from federally recognized tribes. And the migrant and seasonal farm workers is not kind of geographically based, so we can't really project that. So I think one of the questions that FHFA presented within the rule is there an omission? Are there areas that are being left out? And we really welcome comments on that ourselves. One area where HAC potentially identified is persistently poor rural communities. So in many instances, communities that are persistently poor rural communities align with the already identified areas or regions. But in one particular geographic area, and in some specific instances, does not. So we wanted to project quickly, and there are different iterations of this. They're all very similar, but this is a HAC definition of persistently poor rural communities. So the counties identified in orange are those that have had poverty rates of 20% or more for the last 3 decades. And again, you'll see that they align generally with some of the already identified high need areas identified by FHFA in the rule. But one particular area is what we would classify as the rural southeast, or the southern black belt, this kind of crescent shaped area of a high need area, typically through the rural southeast from Mississippi all the way up through the Carolinas. We think that might be an omission, but we welcome your comments on that, and how to kind of include potential areas that are actually high need rural communities that might be omitted. Another good example is in California, in the Central Valley, those areas which many migrant and seasonal farm workers live in those communities are also classified as persistent poverty. And again, you'll note some various areas where there's just overlap, where there's not overlap. There's overlap, but various areas that aren't covered by one of the political designations identified in the rule, but in many instances should be considered a high need rural community. And one proxy would be persistent poverty, but we would welcome other comments on what you would think of other persistently poor communities or other high need rural communities that should be included potentially in the rule. Again, similar to the larger rural definitional requests for comments, FHFA issued a series of 7 or 8 other questions. I won't repeat them verbatim, but they largely are related to the identified high need rural communities, and should those be optimized or changed in any way. Specifically on the definition of Colonia or Middle Appalachia or Lower Mississippi Delta, and migrant and seasonal farm workers, which we at HAC would also very much kind of include your or looking for your feedback. So we also, I'll just re-reference that we provided the online interactive map earlier in the presentation. Hopefully you can access that information to help understand. And as a final link or resource, we just wanted to provide a link to the entire rule. This again was a somewhat brief or abbreviated overview of some of the highlights. We obviously didn't address everything. There were more than 90 questions presented, those specific questions, and we only went through kind of the 70s. So there's a lot of material there. But at that point, we really appreciate you being included, or you joining us today, and we would welcome your feedback or any questions that you might have. So thank you, Shantaria. And again, I think we'll maybe go into the question and answer section. Again, don't feel free to contact us at HACC or me specifically at lance@ruralhome.org.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Lance. We have a few questions here that are holding. The first question is from Laura from CEI. There was a tribal map. She wants to know what the gray areas on that tribal map represent. Go back.
So the gray areas on the tribal map might honestly be, to the best of my knowledge, we left the boundaries on. So on some of the maps, we just didn't have the actual boundary. But on the tribal map, because there were some tribal areas within tribal areas, we left the boundaries. And some of the tribal areas are so small, you can't see the green color. It's just the gray boundary. So that's what the gray areas are. That generally denotes, if I'm interpreting this correctly, that generally denotes a tribal area. It's just that the boundary is actually bigger than the green area that would be identified.
Okay, there's also a question from Tom at FAHI. Wants to know, are there points awarded?
That's a good question. There's kind of an evaluation system, and that's in the end of the rule. It goes over largely how the GSEs will be evaluated across the entire range, not just the rural criteria. My understanding is, and this is still up for interpretation, that there will be a 100-point scale, and that that there would be just scoring within those categories. I don't know if it lays out specifically how the scoring would be developed, but there's generally a 100-point scale across all of the activities, and then the GSEs would be evaluated on a kind of a 5-point scale. Either I think it exceeds high satisfactory, low satisfactory, or fails in the underserved markets. So it's slightly different than the 2010, but there is a point scoring system, and the GSEs will be evaluated annually for their activity.
Oh.
I hope that answers Tom's question. If not, we can get some more details.
All right. Peter from Freddie Mac also has a question. The number of counties in Middle Appalachia.
Yes. So to the best of our calculation, it's 230 counties. We think there might be 238 because of some minor quirks, and this gets into the weeds of what's called a county equivalent. And in some Virginia counties, there's it's a unique geographic element called a county equivalent. But that's our interpretation. Again, we noted before this is up for interpretation, and reading the regulation. There are other northern Ohio counties, but when we interpreted it, it was those kind of central, north central, and south central ARC defined counties. So generally around 230 counties is our calculation, if I'm not mistaken about that. There are a lot of numbers kind of gone back and forth here or are bounced around, but I think that's our general calculation.
All right. Tom also has an additional question. Why does Buffer not use USDA's existing property eligibility link?
Their rationale in the rule is that system is generally, if I'm interpreting the question correctly, you can identify USDA eligibility through an online tool, but generally that is set up for looking up one property at a time, and it wouldn't work well for the large volume of activity that would need to be assessed by the GSEs. We think that possibly, and that was a comment from one of the enterprises, that might have been from the 2010 comments. In the modern era, there could probably be you could probably construct a system that could evaluate them across the board, but for the most part, the current existing system only really allows one lookup area at a time, and it wouldn't work for large tranches or large volumes of activity. That's what was presented in the rule.
Okay, there is a question from Amy with Wisconsin Housing, and it might be something, Lance, that you take offline, but she wants to know, does HAC have a position on duty to serve requirement for manufactured housing? It's her understanding that they will not finance homes in manufactured housing or home communities.
That's a good question. Again, HAC hasn't finalized its position around any of the areas of comment. The manufactured housing is an entirely different section. So there are one of the major kind of questions or components is what would be eligible for duty to serve credit, personal property or real property, and that varies across the type of community or the location. But generally, FHFA in their proposal would not count duty to serve access for personal property lending, although there are some proposals or suggestions that might differ in a community setting based on various protections and ownership status.
Okay, another question from Tom, will financing in rural areas receive points?
I think under the general scheme, if it meets the duty to serve credit, this is what the what the regulator would look at. But generally, if it meets, the prescribed final rule, there would be duty to serve credit issued in rural communities, or there would be credit issued in rural communities, if I'm interpreting that correctly. That's a major component of the rule, so that's one of the three. And in the rural communities and the high need communities, there would be duty to serve credit issued for eligible activities.
Okay, do we have any additional questions? Look like that's about it from the Q&A. Oh, there's one additional question, Lance. What is the best definition of rural?
That's a good question. As we would note, I would say generally there's no perfect definition of rural. That's the position HAC has often taken. Every definition has its pros and cons, and I think we went through some of the pros and cons of each of the definition, and HAC is working vigorously on our own comments to work towards what we would classify as a better or best definition of rural. Again, I think we tried to highlight or with some balance the positives and negatives of each of the definition. If there were a perfect definition of rural, I think I would retire. My job would be over. So, but stay tuned, and HAC will try to work towards the best definition of rural, or provide our comments on the best definition of rural for this particular activity.
All right, if there are no additional questions at this time, we're going to give you guys maybe another, thank you, Tom. Give you guys another maybe few seconds if you're thinking of questions that you might have for Lance. Don't forget, Lance's information is provided. You can contact him directly. His information is showing on the screen. Also, it will be available as part of the materials for download directly following the call. So just a really quick reminder as we move to wrap things up. As I just said, the recording and materials, they will be made available on HAC's website. Also, please be on the lookout for an email containing the link for your certificate of participation, as well as a link to the webinar survey. Please take a moment to complete that survey, because that lets HAC know that we're delivering the most relevant information that's appropriate to your activities. So before we close out, I'd like to ask Lance if he has any follow-up or closeout statements to make.
No, other than, again, we view this as an ongoing dialogue and discussion, and we welcome any of your comments and feedback. We appreciate you sharing time with us today, and we appreciate your feedback. I would only just quickly very much thank Shantari and Dan. There's a lot of work behind the scenes, and the entire HAC team for putting this information together. So thank them a lot. And I've put in a shameless plug for next week's webinar, the HACK webinar or e-learning session on the Community Reinvestment Act in rural in rural areas. We've done a lot of work on that. We think that's going to be a very interesting dialogue as well. So I put in, again, a shameless plug, and generally thank you for being with us today and helping us out. And again, the dialogue is open, so if you have any questions or need assistance, don't hesitate to contact us. So thank you,
All right,
Shantaria.
so I'd like to thank Lance for the wealth of information that he's provided during today's webinar. Also want to reiterate Lance's thank you to all of you for joining us for today's webinar, and wish you a great rest of your afternoon. So thank you very much. Have a good day.